The heat does not rise from the ground. It presses down from a sky the color of bleached bone. It is a physical weight, a presence that bends the light and smothers sound. Out of this shimmering, distorted world, a figure staggers. Juniper Larimer, though she is thinking of herself only as a collection of aches and a single, desperate need for forward motion, does not see the Coyote Lantern Ranch as a destination. She sees it as a pause, a potential end to the falling. The world has been falling away behind her for 2 days, and she has been running just ahead of the collapse. Her blouse, once a respectable calico print fit for a schoolteacher, is now a tattered flag of her flight. A cruel, grasping branch of mesquite has laid it open at the shoulder, and the skin beneath is a raw testament to her passage. Dust has settled into the weave of the fabric, into the lines of her face, into her very lungs. It is the grit between her teeth, the film over her eyes. Her lips, which once formed careful words of instruction for rows of young faces, are cracked and silent, parted only for the shallow, ragged breaths she draws. Under one arm, she clutches a leather folio to her ribs as if it were a vital organ. Its worn corners are slick with her sweat, the leather dark with it. Inside rests her crime, her justification, and her death warrant. The ranch materializes from the heat haze, not as a promise, but as a fact. A low-slung cabin of sun-silvered timber, a porch lost in shadow, a corral whose posts stand like patient sentinels. And on that porch, a man. He is as much a part of the structure as the posts holding up the roof. Tall, even sitting, with the long-limbed frame of a man who fits a horse better than he fits a chair. A hat, its brim pulled low, obscures his face in a personal eclipse. But it cannot hide the stillness. It is a profound and unsettling stillness, not of indolence, but of immense, contained energy. He is not relaxing, he is waiting. His eyes, when a trick of the light finds them, are steady. They do not flick toward her, they do not widen in surprise. They simply watch her torturous approach, taking her in as they would a shift in the wind or the slow crawl of a shadow. His mouth is a single, hard line, a seam stitched shut by old vows and resolutions made in silence. This is Silas Hartwell. Though she does not know his name, she knows only that he is her last, and perhaps most dangerous, hope. She reaches the first step of the porch and her strength fails her. Her knees buckle, and she catches herself on a post, the rough wood biting into her palm. The sound of her own breathing fills the air, a dry, rasping noise that seems an offense to the profound quiet of this place. The man has not moved. He simply watches. "Please," she whispers, the word a painful rasp torn from her throat. It is a sound meant for a prayer, not for a stranger. She swallows dust and tries again, lifting her gaze to the shadow beneath his hat. "Just for tonight." The words hang in the oppressive air between them. Far off, beyond the mesa's edge, a coyote yips, a lonely, laughing sound that only amplifies her desolation. The man on the porch considers her plea. He does not consider her appearance, her torn clothing, or the desperation radiating from her like another layer of heat. He considers the words themselves, "just for tonight." His answer is not a word. It is a slow, deliberate tilt of his head, an acknowledgement, an assent. Then, with an economy of motion that is almost mesmerizing, he rises. He unfolds from the chair, not with the creak of old bones, but with the silent, fluid grace of a predator. He turns and opens the cabin door, holding it wide. It is an invitation into the cool darkness, an offer of sanctuary without a single accompanying question. As she forces her trembling legs to obey, to carry her up the steps and across the threshold, she notices 2 things about him. Around his neck, on a simple rawhide string, rests a small, tin locket. It is plain, unadorned, and seems a strangely sentimental object for a man carved from such hard materials. The second thing is the way he carries himself. It is the posture of a man who once stood on a battlefield and commanded thunder, and who now goes to great lengths to avoid even the smallest of words. He is a fortress, and the door he holds open is the drawbridge. The air inside is a shock to the senses. It tastes of cedar smoke from a long-dead fire and the clean, earthy scent of horses. It is the smell of work, of solitude, of a life pared down to its essentials. A kettle on the cast-iron stove gives a soft, metallic click as it settles, the water within just beginning to stir. By a window that looks out onto the endless expanse of the high desert, a chipped enamel basin waits, its surface cool and white. It seems to have been waiting for her. Silas gestures toward it, then toward a simple wooden chair. He does not speak. He moves through the single room of his home with the same quiet purpose he displayed on the porch. He is a man who communicates through action. His silence a language she is already beginning to learn. June sinks onto the chair, her body screaming with relief, but her mind cannot rest. Her hands, caked with dirt and trembling from a fear that goes deeper than exhaustion, fumble with the ties of the folio. She has to be sure. She has to see it. She pulls out a single, folded sheet of paper. It is a surveyor's map, rendered in precise, confident lines. Stamped in the corner, in stark black ink, is the official seal of Black Fiddle Creek. The sight of it, the tangible proof of the treachery she uncovered, sends a fresh tremor through her. This paper is why she is here. This paper is why men are hunting her. From the ridge she just crossed, a new detail emerges against the skyline, a plume of dust, faint but unmistakable. It is not the random swirl of a dust devil. It is organized, linear, riders, a line of them, combing the flats, moving with the methodical patience of men who are not searching, but tracking. The sound that follows is not from them, but it is of them. A low, mournful moan cuts through the air. The brass whistle of a train engine echoing from Dry Comet Ridge, the railroad, Baron Pike's railroad. Her head snaps up, her eyes wide with a renewed terror. She scans Silas Hartwell's face, searching for any sign of judgment, of suspicion, of the calculation that would tell her he is weighing the reward for her capture against the risk of harboring her. She finds nothing of the sort. His gaze is fixed on the dust plume, his expression unreadable. But what radiates from him is not condemnation. It is a deep, abiding patience. He has seen the riders, he has heard the whistle, and he has not moved. He turns from the window, and his movements become a quiet lesson in hospitality. He moves like a quiet law, an undeniable force of nature. He takes a thick wool blanket from a wooden chest at the foot of his bed and sets it gently over her shoulders. The warmth is immediate, a comfort so profound it almost brings her to tears. He points again to the basin by the window, a clear instruction to wash away the trail's grime. Then he gestures toward a closed door at the back of the cabin, a back room, her room. For the night, he is giving her space, not questions. He is giving her sanctuary, not interrogation. He understands that her story will come when it is ready, or not at all. For now, all that matters is the unspoken agreement between them. The face of the man she is fleeing from flashes in her mind, as clear and sharp as a shard of glass. Baron Pike. A man who bought his way into respectability with railroad money. A man who smiled with his mouth but never with his eyes. A white felt hat, always pristine, and a thin, white scar that cut through his left eyebrow and tugged at his jaw when he was angry. He had presented himself as the savior of Hollow Gate, the bringer of progress. But in the dark, in the secret pages of a second ledger she had found by accident, he was a thief of a different order. He wasn't stealing horses or gold. He was stealing the water, the very lifeblood of the land, and with it, the futures of every homesteader in the valley. And she had stolen his proof. She looks at the silent rancher, this stranger who has offered her refuge. She had begged for one night of safety, and the lonely rancher had said nothing at all. But his silence is not an absence. It is a presence. It is the sound of a heavy bar sliding into place, the solid, reassuring thud of a door locking against the world. It is the most comfort she has felt in 48 hours. From the stove, the kettle begins to trill, a high, piercing whistle that cuts through the tension. It is a sound of normalcy, of home. To the south, a low, distant grumble answers it. Thunder. A storm is rolling in, mirroring the storm that has chased her to this doorstep. The light outside begins to fade, the shadows on the cabin floor stretching into long, dark fingers. A long night is beginning. The trill of the kettle sliced through the quiet, a sharp, metallic cry that seemed to echo the panic in Juniper's own chest. Silas moved from the window, his boots making almost no sound on the plank floor. He took the kettle from the stove, the steam rising in a plume around his head, momentarily obscuring the hard line of his jaw. He poured a stream of scalding water into the chipped enamel basin. The sound, a sharp hiss, before filling a tin mug with the remainder, spooning in dark coffee grounds from a canister. The scent of the coffee, rich and bitter, cut through the aroma of cedar smoke and horses. It was a smell from her old life, a life that had evaporated only 3 days ago, but felt a lifetime gone. She had been Juniper Larimer then, Miss Larimer, the schoolteacher in Hollow Gate, a small, hopeful town clinging to the promise of the railroad. Her world had been one of chalk dust, the rustle of primers, the smell of damp wool drying by the potbelly stove, and the bright, earnest faces of children learning their letters. That world ended in the school's coal bin. It had been a cold snap, unseasonable for late spring, and she had gone to fetch a scuttle of coal herself, the children busy with their slates, tucked behind a loose board at the back, where the damp had warped the wood. She'd found it. Not a strong box, not a secret cache, but a simple second ledger, bound in the same green leather as the one Mr. Abernathy, the school clerk, kept for expenses. This one felt different. Heavier. She had opened it in the waning light of the schoolhouse. The children long gone. The room silent save for the scratch of her own pen as she corrected their work. But her pen stilled, her blood chilled. These were not expenses for chalk and books. These were names. Names of homesteaders she knew. Families whose children sat in her classroom. The Thatcher twins. Widow Eloise. Beside their names. Parcels of land, meticulously noted by range and section, all of them lining the banks of Black Fiddle Creek. And then, the other column bribes, payments to land agents, to surveyors, even to a county clerk, all originating from a holding company she recognized from the brass plaques in town, the Dry Comet Land Rail Company, Baron Pike's company. The scheme unfolded before her, a snake uncoiling in the dust. It was monstrous in its simplicity. Pike, the town's benefactor, the respectable broker bringing progress, was systematically forging claims and buying influence to seize the water rights along Black Fiddle Creek. He would choke the valley dry. He would starve out the very homesteads he publicly promised to support, their land rendered worthless by drought. And then, when they were broken and desperate, his railroad would save them, buying their parched land for pennies on the dollar. He wasn't just building a railroad. He was stealing a valley. She had been a fool. She had confronted Pike's clerk, Mr. Abernathy, a nervous, bird-like man who smelled of bay rum and quiet desperation. She had brought the ledger to him, her voice shaking with a righteous anger she hadn't known she possessed. "This is theft, Mr. Abernathy. You are helping him steal their lives." Mr. Abernathy had turned a color she'd never seen before, a pale, greenish white. He had stammered, denied, and then, seeing the proof in her hands, he had simply crumpled. The next morning, Mr. Abernathy had vanished. He didn't just leave town. He was gone, his boarding room emptied, his desk cleared, as if he had never been. And then they came for her. Not Pike. Pike was too smart for that. He sent Deputy Finch, a man whose smile never reached his eyes. He'd arrived at her boarding house with a warrant, claiming a serious allegation. While she stood, frozen in her parlor, he and another man had overturned her room. The discovery was almost theatrical. From the bottom of her small trunk, beneath her winter woolens, Deputy Finch pulled Baron Pike's gold signet ring, a ring he famously wore, a ring she had never seen up close in her life. "Theft," Finch had declared, his voice full of false regret. "A terrible business, Miss Larimer. Baron Pike is devastated. Thought of you as a daughter. A sham hearing was set for the next day. She knew what that meant. A compliant judge, a packed courtroom, and a swift verdict. She would be branded a thief, her word against Pike's worthless, her reputation destroyed. And the ledger, it would disappear, just like Mr. Abernathy. So she had run, not with the original ledger, they would have been watching for that, before confronting Abernathy. In a fit of cold premonition, she had spent an entire night by candlelight, her fingers cramping, meticulously copying the most damning pages. She ran with those copies and the water rights maps she'd taken from the school's geography files. Thin armor against such thick, pervasive corruption. A shadow fell over her. Silas Hartwell was standing before her, holding out the steaming mug of coffee. He placed it in her trembling hands, his fingers brushing hers. They were rough, calloused, but surprisingly gentle. He then set down a wooden bowl filled with a thick stew, the smell of jerky and beans rising from it. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a small, framed slate, the kind her youngest pupils used, and a piece of chalk. He set it on the table between them, in a small, neat, and strikingly steady hand. He wrote 2 words, "Eat first." The sound of the chalk on the slate was louder than any word he could have spoken. It was a dry, scraping sound that startled her, and the realization landed with the force of a physical blow. He had not spoken, not one word. The simple tilt of his head on the porch, the gestures to the basin, the blanket, the back room. It was all silence. She looked up at his face, searching his steady eyes for the reason. Was it a wound, something from the war that had cost him his voice? Or was it a choice, a vow of silence in a world too full of lies? The tin locket on its rawhide string offered no answers. He simply sat back down in his own chair across the room, picked up a piece of harness, and began to methodically check the stitching, granting her the dignity of not being watched as she ate. She ate. The stew was simple, nourishing, and the first food she'd tasted in 2 days. The warmth spread through her, bringing with it not strength, but a profound, bone-deep weariness. With the food came the resurgence of her fear, no longer a sharp panic, but a cold, heavy dread. Pike had not just let her run, he had turned himself into the victim. A poster she'd glimpsed tacked to the wall of the land office in Dry Comet Ridge, just before she'd fled into the open desert, flashed in her mind. It used soft words. Questioning. Missing property. But the name beneath it meant iron. Levi Drum. A bounty man. Some said, a tracker. Others whispered. A man Pike hired when he needed a problem solved with a finality that deputies and courts couldn't provide. Pike had hired Levi Drum and 2 other riders to search for his stolen property. She knew they weren't being paid to find a ring. They were being paid to find her. The rumor web would already be spun. The schoolteacher ran with the money, stole the railroad payroll. They would paint her as a common thief, a hysterical woman, erasing the truth of her discovery with a more believable, sordid lie. She looked down at the leather folio in her lap, her only defense, her only weapon. She untied the leather string, her fingers stiff. She spread the contents on the small table beside the slate. 3 sheets of paper, brittle as moth wings, covered in her own neat script. The names, the parcels, the payments, and the map, the one she'd clutched for 2 days. She smoothed it, her eyes tracing the blue line of Black Fiddle Creek. And then, her gaze locked on the detail that had consumed her thoughts during her flight. A detail not on the original, but one she'd added from another of Pike's diagrams in the ledger. A small, hastily sketched trestle bridge, marked with a single, stark red X. Gravel Mercy Bridge. It was the key. She felt it. But to what a horse stamped outside, it was a sharp, sudden sound, a hoof striking hard-packed earth, followed by a nervous whinny. June froze, the spoon halfway to her mouth, her heart, which had just begun to beat at a normal rhythm, hammered against her ribs. They were here, the dust plume, the riders. They had found her. She looked at Silas. He hadn't moved, but his head was tilted, his attention fixed not on the door, but on the window. He was listening, assessing. His hands had stopped their work on the harness. Then, slowly, his right hand moved. It did not move toward the rifle mounted on the wall over the hearth. It did not move toward a pistol she assumed he must wear. His hand drifted to the coiled lariat hanging from a peg by the door. His fingers rested lightly on the tightly wound rope. The choice was so unexpected, so strange. It momentarily bypassed her fear. He was a man who preferred to end fights, not start them. A man who preferred a tool of capture to a weapon of killing. The realization was both a comfort and a terror. The horse stamped again, closer this time, just outside the cabin wall. Silas held up one hand. A silent command. Stay. He rose, not with haste, but with that same deliberate, fluid grace, and moved to the door. And then, just as he reached for the bar, a tremendous groaning crack echoed from above. The entire cabin seemed to shudder. A violent gust of wind, the vanguard of the coming storm, slammed into the ranch. The porch rafters, solid timbers that had stood for decades, bowed under the sudden pressure with a sound like a giant's warning. The horse outside whinnied, a sound of animal complaint. Not alarm. It was his own horse, tied to the rail, spooked by the wind. A false alarm. June let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding, her body slumping. The relief was so intense it left her weak. Silas looked back at her. He didn't smile, didn't nod. He simply observed her relief, then turned and slid the heavy wooden bar across the door, securing it against the night. The storm had arrived. June pulled the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. She stared at the barred door, a flimsy piece of wood against the rising howl of the wind and the far more dangerous threat of men like Levi Drum. She looked at the silent rancher, who had returned to his chair and his mending, his presence a silent, solid bulwark in the small, lamp-lit room. One night, she thought of her own desperate plea on his porch. I only asked for one night. The lantern on the table did not fight the darkness. It merely carved a small, warm circle of existence within it. The rest of the cabin receded into deep, shifting shadows, the corners of the room lost to the night. Outside, the promised storm had finally broken its silence. It began as a whisper, a tentative tapping on the roof shingles, like a nervous visitor. Then, finding its courage, the rain grew insistent, the drops tightening into a steady, drumming rhythm that became the new heartbeat of the world. June had used the hot water from the kettle, her hands shaking so badly at first that she'd slopped water onto the plank floor. Now, seated at the table in the pool of amber light, she tended to the wound on her shoulder. The mesquite thorn had torn deep, a ragged line that stung with a hot, persistent fire. The dust of the trail, caked with her own sweat, was ground into it, and she worked to clean it with a scrap of clean linen Silas had provided, biting her lip against the sharp, cleansing pain. He did not gawk, he did not pry. Silas, having provided the basin, the cloth, and a small, dark glass jar, had returned to his chair outside the main circle of light. But he had not returned to his harness mending. He was preparing. He took a small tin from a shelf and opened it. Inside, nested in clean cotton, were several surgical needles. He picked one out, held it to the lantern light to inspect its point, and then, with a pair of pliers, held it directly in the lamp's chimney, the metal glowing a dull red as the flame purified it. He set this down on a clean rag, alongside a spool of dark, waxed thread. Finally, he pushed the small, dark jar toward her. She opened it. The smell was sharp and clean, a potent wave of pine resin, camphor, and something herbal she couldn't name. It was a salve, dark and thick. When she gingerly applied it to the raw cut, the stinging fire was instantly replaced by a deep, cool tingling. It was the smell of healing, of competence. He had laid out the needle and thread with the same quiet practicality. He was not suggesting she would need stitches. He was merely providing the tools in case she did. He saw her glance at them, her eyes wide, and he simply shook his head once. A small, reassuring motion. Tools, not orders. He understood. He understood she was not just a woman in need of rescue. She was a person tending to her own wounds, and he was merely the quartermaster. This silent, practical care was more unnerving than 100 questions would have been. It left her with nothing to push against, no defense to raise, to fill the silence, to anchor himself. Silas picked up the slate. The chalk scraped, the sound overly loud in the drum-filled quiet. He turned it toward her. He had sketched, with a few deft and surprisingly accurate lines, a map of the ranch's immediate surroundings. It wasn't a surveyor's map like hers, but a map of escape. He'd drawn the cabin, the barn, the corral. Then his chalk line had moved beyond the fences. He'd sketched a narrow, jagged line leading away from the back of the property, Arroyo Seco. He'd written, beside it, a fainter dotted line that climbed the mesa sheep path. And finally, a thick cluster of strokes behind the hay barn windbreak. He was showing her the ways out. He was giving her the knowledge of his land, a set of keys to her own survival. Should he fail? June leaned forward, her gaze fixed on the chalk lines. The map he'd drawn was a gesture of profound trust. She felt the need to understand it, to commit it to her own memory. She lifted a hand, her index finger still damp from the basin, and traced the jagged line of the arroyo. "This," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "This leads. Where?" As she spoke, Silas had leaned in as well, his own hand lifting to point, to clarify. His finger, calloused and marked with the small, white scars of a rancher's life, moved to the same line she was tracing, their hands, suspended over the slate, almost touched. It was a distance of less than an inch, but it crackled with the energy of a lightning strike. The air between their fingers seemed to thicken. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin. She saw the dark hairs on his knuckles, the clean, short-trimmed nails, the sheer, solid strength of his hand. It was a hand that knew work, that knew rope, that knew how to hold on and how to build. Her finger wavered, tracing the chalk, the slate, damp from her touch, let out a high-pitched, agonizing squeak. The sound shattered the moment. Both of them withdrew, their hands pulling back as if from a hot stove. June's face flushed, a heat rising in her neck that had nothing to do with her wounds or the fire. She looked down, her heart hammering. He, too, looked away, his gaze finding a spot on the far wall, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. They were two solitary people, islands in the storm, and they had just, for a brief, electric second, felt the edges of their solitude brush against each other. Shy, alert, and suddenly, intensely aware of the small, lamp-lit space they shared. The rain hammered the roof, filling the new, awkward silence. The lull stretched, no longer comfortable, but charged. June felt a desperate need to break it, to return to the world of facts, to put words between them once more, even if he would not return them. "Do you—" she began, her voice unsteady. She cleared her throat and tried again, looking at his profile in the shadows. "Do you live here alone, Mr. Hartwell?" She hadn't even known his name until she'd seen it, small and faded, on a brand registration certificate tacked to the wall by the door. S. Hartwell. He did not turn. He sat for a moment, the rain drumming, as if considering the weight of the question. It was a simple, polite inquiry. But in this place, in this moment, it felt like a trespass. Finally, he gave a single, slow nod. He picked up the slate again. The scrape of chalk was her only reply. He turned it. His neat, small hand had written only 4 words. "Brother died. I stayed." The words landed in her chest with a physical weight. Brother died. The past tense, I stayed. The present, the locket, the solitude, the silence. It was not a story, but it was the title of one. It was the reason for the emptiness of the second chair at the table, the reason the ranch was named Coyote Lantern. A name for two, a light in the dark. He wasn't just a man of few words. He was a man who had perhaps lost his words when he lost his brother. She suddenly felt the profound selfishness of her intrusion. She had brought her danger, her fear, into this house of quiet grief. this monument to a single, devastating fact. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and she meant it. Before he could nod, or write, or offer any acknowledgement, the world outside changed. The steady drumming of the rain did not stop. It was joined, a new sound, a counter-rhythm, a wet, splaying, a rhythmic beat. It was not the sharp, clean strike of a single horse moving with purpose. It was the heavy, mud-sucking sound of several horses, walking, pausing, uncertain. Hoofbeats, close. They had splayed at the lane, by the main gate. June's blood ran cold. The stew she had eaten turned to lead in her stomach. Silas did not jolt. He did not gasp. His reaction was faster, more fluid, and infinitely more terrifying. In one seamless motion, he leaned forward and, with a deft pinch of his calloused fingers, extinguished the lantern's flame. He did not blow it out. He pinched the wick, shrinking the flame from a bright, warm circle to a tiny, blue bead, a ghost of a light that cast no illumination. The cabin was plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. The only light was the faint, gray rectangle of the window, now streaked with running water. The only sound was the roar of the rain and the new, terrible sound of a man's cough, low and wet, from the gate. They were here. "He's in there," a voice called, thin and nasal. "I seen the light. It just went out." "Shut up, Ames," another voice growled, a voice that sounded like gravel and cheap whiskey, a voice that laughed, low and without humor. "He knows we're here, don't he? Rancher." They were in the dark, but they were not blind. They moved from memory. June could hear the faint rustle of Silas's shirt as he rose, the whisper of his boots on the planks. He was a creature of this darkness. It was his element. She, however, was frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. A shape blotted out the gray light of the window. Silas, he was peering out, his head tilted. He turned back, a darker shadow in the gloom. She could not see his face, but she felt his gaze on her. He raised a hand and pointed, jabbing his finger twice toward the back of the cabin, toward the back room he had offered her, toward the back door, toward the arroyo, the sheep path, the escape routes. He was telling her to go, run, now. He was staying. He was going to face them, to buy her the time she needed. June's mind screamed, run. Yes, that was the plan. Run, hide, survive. But her legs were stone. To leave this man, this silent stranger who had offered her a blanket and salve and a map to safety, to leave him to face Levi Drum and his men. She saw Silas pause, even in the dark. She could read the shift in his posture. His hand, which had been pointing, lowered. He stood still for a long, agonizing second. She could hear him breathe, a single, slow inhale. Then, decisively, he shook his head. It was a sharp, angry, negative motion. No. He stepped toward her, so close she could feel the heat of him. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm, not cruel but unbreakable. He wasn't pushing her toward the back door. He was pulling her with him, toward the front. He put his other hand on her shoulder and pushed her down, into the shadows beside the doorframe, shielding her with his own body. He was making a new decision, a decision that included her, a decision that said, "We don't run from our own home." June swallowed. The terror was a solid thing in her throat, a metallic, coppery taste, the taste of old pennies, the taste of absolute, final fear. This was it. This was where the running stopped. This was where she died, or where she didn't. She looked at the vast, dark shape of the man beside her. His stillness was not the stillness of a rock. It was the stillness of a cougar, coiled, every muscle waiting. And in that moment, the terror did not vanish. But something new rose up to meet it, resolve, a cold, hard spine of it. She had run from Hollow Gate. She had run from the law. She had run across the desert. She was done running. She squared her shoulders, her back pressing against the rough log wall. Silas turned from her. He reached for the heavy wooden bar, his movements unhurried. He lifted it from its brackets, the wood making a soft, sliding sound, a sound of invitation. He opened the door. He did not fling it wide. He opened it calmly and stepped out onto the porch, into the driving, wind-swept rain. June watched from the darkness, her heart in her throat. Silas did not reach for a weapon. He did not stand in a crouch. He stood tall, his hands at his sides, his posture as easy and rhythmic as a windmill's steady tick in a prairie breeze. The rain immediately plastered his dark hair to his head, his shirt to his broad shoulders. Water streamed from the brim of his hat in a steady curtain. He was a man checking on his livestock in a storm, not a man facing down a threat. Two shapes detached themselves from the deeper blackness by the gate. They moved forward. Two mounted figures, their horses uneasy in the mud and wind. "Well, now," the gravelly voice of Levi Drum called out, saturated with a false, jovial menace. His laugh was a wet bark. "That's neighborly." One of them dismounted. A shorter, thinner man, Ames, the clerk. He held a lantern, but the wind and rain made the flame within it dance and sputter, casting wild, leaping shadows. "Kind of you to harbor a thief, neighbor," Ames called out, his voice thin and nasal, trying for authority and finding only petulance. "We're here on behalf of Baron Pike. We're looking for that woman. We know she's in there." Levi Drum stayed on his horse, a dark, looming shape, letting his lackey do the talking. Silas Hartwell said nothing. He just stood there, the rain lashing him, his face a mask of shadow. He was stillness incarnate. He was the mesa, the rock, the unmoving center of the storm. The wind howled, and the rain answered for him. A furious, drumming roar that seemed to say, "This is my land, and you are not welcome." Levi Drum's boots hit the mud with a wet, sucking sound that seemed to pull him down into the earth. He swung down from his saddle with a practiced motion, a fluid dismount that was spoiled by the slick, treacherous ground. He caught his balance, his body a low, solid knot of menace in the sputtering lantern light. As he straightened, he let his right hand fall, his fingers coming to rest on the worn leather of his holster, the tips just brushing the checkered grip of the revolver within. It was not a draw. It was a statement, a casual, arrogant promise of violence, meant to be seen, meant to be understood by the silent man on the porch. The clerk, Ames, scrambled down after him, less a man than a collection of wet, sharp angles. He clutched a folded paper in his hand, waving it as if it were a talisman against the storm and the silent figure before them. The rain had already worked its mischief on the document. The ink was starting to bleed, the crisp folds turning to soft, pulpy seams. It was a piece of paper pretending to be authority, and the weather was calling its bluff. "This is a warrant. Hartwell," Ames chirped, his nasal voice straining to cut through the wind. "Signed by Deputy Finch himself. You are legally required to cooperate. You are harboring a fugitive, a thief." Silas Hartwell did not so much as glance at the sodden paper. His gaze remained fixed on Levi Drum, the real threat. He held the man's eyes for a long, silent beat, two predators sizing each other up across a rain-swept no-man's land. Then, with an infuriating lack of haste, Silas turned, stepped back inside the cabin, and retrieved the small slate from the table. He returned to the porch, holding the slate under the slight protection of the eaves, and began to write. From her hiding place in the deep shadow of the doorway, June could hear the faint, dry scratch of the chalk. It was the only sound in the world besides the rain and her own frantic heartbeat. It was the sound of defiance. Silas turned the slate toward them. The chalk letters were stark and white against the black surface, each one formed with the same neat, steady hand. "Leave. Weather's meaner than me tonight." The words were a masterpiece of dry, understated threat. It was not a boast. It was a simple statement of fact, a piece of local wisdom offered to travelers. The storm was a known quantity. He was not. Ames squinted, unable to comprehend a man who would write when he should be cowering, but Levi Drum understood. A slow, ugly sneer spread across his face. Twisting his lips, he took a step forward, the mud sucking at his boot. "Is that so?" Drum's voice was a low growl. "Well, your weather ain't got a warm fire. We'll come warm ourselves inside, rancher, and we'll see if we can't find our property while we're at it." He took another step, his hand still resting on his gun. Ames followed, emboldened by his leader's confidence. They were 10 feet from the porch steps, their intentions as plain as the rain on their faces. And then Silas Hartwell did the last thing June expected. He stepped aside. He moved from the center of the doorway, clearing the path, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, "Be my guest." It was a gesture of concession, of surrender. Ames's face lit with a triumphant smirk. Even Drum seemed momentarily surprised, his forward momentum faltering. For a heartbeat, the tension broke, replaced by the predator's satisfaction in the face of a capitulation. It was a fatal miscalculation. In that heartbeat, as Drum's mind was processing his victory, Silas's left hand, which had been hanging loosely at his side, shot out. It did not go for a weapon. It darted under the lip of the porch flooring, into the dark, damp space beneath. His fingers closed around a loop of twine. He pulled. The sound that erupted from the direction of the barn was not a sound of nature. It was a harsh, jarring, metallic clatter, a furious, panicked rattle, like a dozen tin cans filled with rocks being shaken by a giant. It was the sound of pure, manufactured chaos. The effect was instantaneous. The great wooden doors of the barn, which had been closed against the storm, did not swing open. They slammed open, bursting from their latch as if kicked by a battering ram. A shape, a living projectile of terror, hurtled out into the rain-swept yard. It was a mule, its eyes wide with animal panic, its ears laid flat against its skull. It was not running. It was exploding, propelled by the terrifying, unseen noise that had erupted behind it. The mule, whose name was Beatrice, and who was ordinarily of a placid and philosophical disposition, was now a 400-pound cannonball of pure instinct, and her trajectory was aimed directly at the space between Levi Drum and his clerk. Drum reacted with the speed of a man who had survived his profession through instinct alone. He didn't think, he dove. He threw himself sideways, a graceless, desperate lunge that ended with him landing hard in a deep, soupy puddle of mud and manure. The air left his lungs in a grunt of pained surprise. His fine, broad-brimmed hat, the symbol of his authority, flew from his head and landed upside down in the mire, where it instantly began to fill with brown, murky water. Ames, the clerk, possessed no such instincts. He froze, his mouth a perfect awe of terror. He had time to let out a single, high-pitched squeak before the mule's shoulder clipped him. It was not a direct hit, but it was more than enough. Ames went down as if poleaxed, his legs flying out from under him. He landed face first in the mud. The warrant, his flimsy shield of authority, was driven into the muck beneath him, becoming one with the earth. The yard was now a scene of pandemonium. Beatrice the mule, having cleared the initial obstacle, continued her panicked flight, but she was not running aimlessly. From the blackness of the cabin doorway, June leaned out. She didn't shout. She didn't wave. She made a sound, a sharp, clicking noise with her tongue against the roof of her mouth. It was a sound Silas had used earlier to call his horse, a sound she had filed away in her memory. It was a sound Beatrice knew. The mule's panicked brain registered the familiar signal, and she veered hard to the left, her hooves churning the mud into a thick spray. Her new path took her directly toward the 2 men's horses, who were already skittish from the rattling and the storm. The sight of a terrified mule bearing down on them was the final straw. They reared, whinnying in fright, their reins pulling free from the flimsy tie rail, while all eyes were on the mule. Silas moved. He was not on the porch anymore. He was a shadow in motion. Gliding across the yard toward the main corral gate that opened onto the lane, a heavy log chain was used to secure it at night. He did not unloop it. He grabbed the free end and, with a powerful flick of his wrists, sent it snaking through the air. The chain wrapped itself around the post of a smaller, adjacent gate, effectively blocking the most direct path back to the road. He had not built a wall. He had altered the geometry of the yard. He had turned his home into a moving maze, its paths now dictated by the panicked movements of 3 large animals. No guns were fired. Not a single punch was thrown. The battle was fought with a tin rattle, a spooked mule, a whispered click, and an old log chain. The only sounds were the furious, half-intelligible curses of Levi Drum, the pathetic moans of the mud-caked clerk, the frantic drumming of hooves, the relentless roar of the rain, and the quiet, undeniable creak and groan of the old ranch's stubborn, unyielding fences. Drum finally staggered to his feet. He was a fearsome sight, covered head to toe in a thick, brown slurry. His face was a mask of fury and humiliation. He located his hat, a sad, waterlogged ruin, and slapped it against his thigh, sending a shower of mud in all directions. He turned his venomous glare on Silas, who was now standing calmly by the corral. The end of the log chain held loosely in one hand. The fight was over. They had lost, and they had lost in the most ignominious way possible. They had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and defeated by a silent man and a farm animal. "This ain't over, Hartwell," Drum spat, his voice thick with rage. He stalked over to the whimpering clerk and hauled him to his feet by the collar of his coat. Ames came up sputtering, looking like a freshly unearthed root vegetable. "You'll hang for this," Ames shrieked, wiping mud from his eyes. "Assaulting an officer of the—" "Shut up, you fool!" Drum snarled, shoving him toward their spooked horses, who had thankfully been corralled by the new configuration of the gates. He grabbed their reins, his movements jerky with anger. "We're leaving." He managed to get Ames onto his horse, then swung himself into his own saddle. He looked back at the ranch, at the dark cabin, at the silent figure of Silas Hartwell. "We'll be back," Drum promised, his voice carrying over the wind. "And we won't be alone. We're going to fetch the sheriff of Hollow Gate, Sheriff Miller. He's a friendly man. Hartwell, he'll be real interested to hear how you treat visitors." With that, he spurred his horse, and they galloped away. Not down the lane, but through a break in the lower fence, their retreat as chaotic and undignified as their attack had been. June finally let out the breath she'd been holding, her lungs aching. Her entire body was trembling, not from cold, but from a bizarre, exhilarating surge of adrenaline. She stepped out onto the porch as Silas returned from the yard. He walked into the faint light spilling from the open door, the rain still streaming from his hat. He was not smiling, but there was a light in his eyes, a flicker of something that looked like grim satisfaction. He picked up the slate, wiped it clean with the heel of his hand, and wrote again. "They'll fetch Crook County law. We'll fetch real law." He turned the slate to her. She read the words, and her heart, which had been hammering with a mixture of terror and triumph, gave a sudden, powerful thud. It was not a question. It was a statement, a declaration. He wasn't just helping her survive the night. He was joining her. The word was a shield. The word was a sword. She nodded, a single, sharp dip of her chin. Words felt useless, inadequate. The fear was still there, a cold knot deep inside her. But it was no longer the whole story. For the first time in days, it was accompanied by the oddest feeling relief. But it wasn't the weak, grateful relief of a victim. It was relief with a spine. It was the relief of a soldier who has found an ally in a foxhole. The relief of knowing you are no longer fighting alone. Silas looked from her face, down to the yard, and then up at the sky. The storm, as if its work were done, was already beginning to slacken. The furious drumming on the roof softened to a steady patter. The rain, which had been their accomplice, now set about its final task. It washed the churned mud smooth, erasing the deep tracks of the horses, the scuffed boot prints of the men, the entire record of the confrontation. It washed their footprints clean, leaving the yard pristine and untouched. The porch held their shared breath, the silent space between them heavy with the secret of what had just happened. The night was not over, but the battle had been won. The dawn did not arrive. It seeped into the world. It was a slow, quiet dilution of the night's ink, turning the absolute black outside the window to a deep, bruised purple, then to the soft, luminous gray of a river pearl. The storm had passed on, leaving the air washed clean and tasting of wet earth and sage. The only remnant of its fury was the sound from the valley below, a low, steady roar. The voice of Black Fiddle Creek, swollen with runoff, running high and brown and angry. June had not slept. Not truly. She had rested in the small back room, a space that was spare, clean, and smelled of dried lavender and old wool. But her mind had not been still. It had replayed the chaos in the yard, the panicked flight of the mule, the satisfying sight of Levi Drum's hat filling with mud, and through it all, the image of Silas Hartwell, standing silent in the rain, an immovable object against a contemptible force. She emerged from the room as the first real light touched the mesa. She found him on the porch, already awake, or perhaps never having slept at all. He sat in his customary chair, not looking out at the new day, but down at his hands, where he was carefully, methodically turning the small tin locket over and over on its rawhide string. He did not seem to be inspecting it, but simply feeling its familiar weight, its cool, smooth surface. He looked up as she stepped onto the porch, and his hand stilled, the locket coming to rest against the worn fabric of his shirt. Her own hands felt useless. She clutched the sleeve of her blouse, the one the mesquite had torn. The salve had cooled the fire in the wound, but the fabric was a tattered mess. She found the small sewing kit Silas had left on the table, the boiled needle, the waxed thread, and sat on the top step of the porch, turning her shoulder to the light. The needle felt clumsy in her fingers, so different from a piece of chalk or a pen. But she worked with a schoolteacher's meticulousness, drawing the edges of the tear together, her stitches small and even. It was a small act of repair, a way to reclaim some piece of herself from the chaos of the flight. After a few moments, Silas rose and went inside. He returned with 2 tin mugs of coffee, the steam rising from them in fragrant clouds. He didn't hand one to her. Instead, he set it down on the porch rail beside her, a respectful, silent offering. He took his own and leaned against a porch post, looking out at the washed world. They sat that way for a long time, the silence stretching between them. But it was a different silence from the night before. The tension was gone. The fear and suspicion had been scoured away by the shared victory, however temporary. This quiet was comfortable. It was solid. It was warm as fresh-baked bread. June drew the thread tight and snipped it with her teeth. She ran a finger over the neat, dark line of stitches. It was a scar on the fabric, but it was a scar that would hold. "I think," she said, her voice soft in the morning air, "I might have misjudged silence." Silas did not turn his head, but she knew he was listening. He was always listening. "I always thought of it as an emptiness, a lack of something," she continued, trying to find the right words. "But last night, your silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was a shield." She looked up at his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the steady set of his gaze. "Sometimes," she concluded, the realization settling into her bones, "it is a mercy, not an absence." He stood motionless for another long moment, sipping his coffee, his eyes on the far horizon where the sun was beginning to burn through the gray clouds. Then he set his mug down on the rail, retrieved his slate from just inside the door, and wrote. He didn't show it to her immediately. He looked at the words he had written, his expression unreadable, as if weighing their truth one last time. Then he held it out. Words cost more after war. She read the sentence, and a profound, aching understanding bloomed in her chest. It was not an excuse. It was not a story. It was a reason. It spoke of a past filled with noise, with orders shouted, with the screams of men, with the deafening thunder of cannons. It spoke of a world where words were used as weapons, or were rendered meaningless by the scale of the horror. And it spoke of the vow a man might make to himself afterward, to never again waste a word, to never again let them be cheapened. She looked at the tin locket, a silent testament to a memory, and she understood, without needing to pry, without asking a single question. She simply nodded, and he wiped the slate clean. After the coffee, the day's work began. Fence needs checking, he had written. Storms hard on old wire. And so they walked. He carried a heavy tool and a roll of wire over his shoulder, and she walked beside him. Her folio of papers left safely in the cabin. The world was alive. The air was sharp and cool. Rivulets of water still coursed down the arroyos, and the sagebrush released its pungent, cleansing scent into the morning. Together, they walked the perimeter of his property. It was a lesson taught in a language she was just beginning to learn. He didn't speak, but he taught her everything. He showed her how a post, loosened by the soft, wet ground, could be tamped firm again. He showed her the precise way to use the heavy fencing tool to grip a broken strand of wire, to pull it taut with a grunt of effort, and to twist it, binding the wound in the fence with a neat, strong splice. Her hands, soft from a life of books and chalk, were soon raw and scratched. But she did not complain. She watched his hands, how they moved with an economy and certainty that was mesmerizing. She learned to twist the wire, the cold metal biting into her palms. She learned to watch the clouds scudding in from the west, to read their bellies for the promise of more rain or a clearing sky. She learned to read his cattle, scattered across the pasture, like sentences. A cow standing alone meant illness. A calf separated from its mother meant trouble. A herd bunched together near a high point meant they sensed a change in the weather. It was the prose of survival, and Silas Hartwell was its most eloquent author. They worked their way along the southern fence line, the cottonwoods that lined the creek bed below them still dripping from the night's rain. They were in a comfortable rhythm, a shared silence of labor. When it happened, a flash of impossible color, a living ember against the gray-green backdrop of the trees, a scarlet tanager, brilliant, breathtaking, flitted from one branch to another, a jewel in the washed-clean world. The sight was so unexpected, so purely beautiful, that a sound escaped June's lips before she could stop it. A laugh. It was not a giggle or a chuckle. It was a full, unburdened laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated delight. It was the sound of a woman who had, for one perfect, fleeting moment, completely forgotten to be afraid. The sound startled her as much as it did the bird, which immediately took flight and vanished. She put a hand to her mouth, her cheeks flushing. The laugh felt like a foreign thing, something that belonged to a different person, a different life. She glanced at Silas, expecting to see annoyance, or perhaps just his usual stoicism. He was looking at her, and for the first time, the line of his mouth had softened. It was not a smile, not even close, but the hardness was gone, and his eyes held a warmth that was as surprising as the tanager's flight. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, "It's all right, that sound is welcome here," and then he turned back to the fence, leaving her with the lingering echo of her own forgotten joy. They returned to the cabin as the sun climbed toward its zenith, the warmth on their backs a welcome comfort. The immediate threat of the land had been addressed. Now, it was time to face the other threat. June spread her copied ledger pages and the water rights map across the small kitchen table. In the clear, honest light of day, the documents looked even more sinister. It was a map of lies, a geography of greed. The neat columns of figures were like crooked fences, walling off honest people from their own livelihoods. The creek beds on the map were not just lines of blue ink. They were veins carrying the lifeblood of the valley. And the signatures, the ones she knew were forgeries, were a testament to the casual evil of a man like Baron Pike. She explained it all, her voice low and steady, pointing to the names, the parcels, the dates of the payments. Silas listened, his gaze intense, moving from the papers to her face and back again. He absorbed the information without interruption, his stillness a silent invitation for her to continue, to lay out the entire, ugly truth. When she was finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Silas stood over the table for a long time, his hands braced on its surface, his head bowed as he studied the map. He was not just looking at it, he was reading it, the way he had read the clouds and the cattle His finger traced the path of Black Fiddle Creek, then moved up, over the lines representing the homesteads Pike was targeting. And then his finger stopped. It stopped on the one detail she had added herself, the small, hand-drawn sketch of the railroad trestle, the red X she had marked beside it, Gravel Mercy Bridge. He looked up at her, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He did not ask about the names or the money. He went straight to the heart of the matter, to the one piece of the puzzle that represented movement, an event, a future action. He picked up his slate. Train schedule. The two words were like a key turning in a lock. Market day. She answered immediately, her own mind racing to catch up with his. In Quarry Bell. It's always noon on a Wednesday. That's tomorrow. Her voice grew more urgent as the pieces clicked into place in her own head. The ledger mentioned investors. Pike is bringing them out from the city. He's scheduled to ride with them tomorrow, to survey the trestle and the land his company has acquired. She saw it then. A plan. A desperate, audacious plan. Not to run, not to hide, but to fight. We could create a trap, she said, the words tumbling out, her hands gesturing over the map. Not with bullets, not with violence, but with proof, with the truth. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for him to see her vision. If we could stop the train, Silas, not wreck it, not hurt anyone, but stop it, on the trestle, with Pike and his investors on board. She took a breath, her idea solidifying. Levi Drum said they were fetching Sheriff Miller from Hollow Gate. He's Pike's man, but Quarry Bell is in the next county. They have their own law, their own judge, a circuit judge. Judge Warham is supposed to be in town for market day. If we could force a hearing, right there, on the tracks, with the investors as witnesses. If we could present the ledger pages and the map to a real judge, an impartial one. She trailed off, her plan hanging in the air, a fragile, impossible thing. She watched Silas's face, searching for a sign. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, she saw it. A change. It started in his eyes. They began to brighten. It was a strange, powerful transformation. His eyes, normally so steady and contained, began to gleam with a new light, the way some men's do when they watch a line of dark. Powerful thunderheads stack up on the horizon, promising a storm that will break the heat and change the world. It was the light of a man who saw not a risk, but an opportunity. A man who was not afraid of the coming storm, but who welcomed it. A man who was ready for a fight. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He straightened up, his gaze locked with hers. A silent, powerful affirmation passing between them. He picked up the piece of chalk. He did not write a word. He simply tapped the surface of the slate twice. Tap, tap. It was a sound as clear and final as a judge's gavel. It was a sound as binding as a sworn oath. It meant yes. The yes hung in the air. A silent, two-tap covenant that transformed the small cabin from a shelter into a command post. The energy shifted immediately. The slow, reactive rhythm of survival was replaced by a sharp, forward-leaning pulse. This was no longer about running. It was about building a trap. It was the energy of a heist. The plan, as it took shape on Silas's slate and in June's low, urgent whispers, was a piece of clever, lawful sabotage. They would not use dynamite or bullets. They would use the railroad's own rules against it. Every rail line has one, June explained, her finger tracing the track on her map. An emergency signal, a flag protocol that an engineer is legally bound to obey. It signifies a track obstruction that isn't immediately visible, a washout, a rock slide. To ignore it is to risk a catastrophic derailment. She, the schoolteacher, knew the theory from a book on civil engineering she'd once assigned for a report. Silas, the man of practical knowledge, knew the materials. He disappeared into his workshop and returned with a large, clean canvas sheet, an old feed sack, washed and mended. From the barn, he brought a small bucket of black, viscous pitch used for sealing the roof against the rain. Together, in the middle of the cabin floor, they crafted their signal. June sketched the design in chalk first, a large, stark X, its lines thick and uncompromising. Then Silas, with a surprising delicacy, used a flat piece of wood to apply the hot, sticky pitch, following her lines exactly. The smell filled the room, sharp and acrid. The smell of construction, of something being built to last. As they worked, their hands often brushed, their shoulders bumped. Each touch was accidental, born of the task, but each sent a small, quiet current through the air between them. They were a team, their separate skills braided into a single, strong cord. When it was done, they hung it from a rafter to dry, a lantern and a white canvas sheet painted with a black pitch cross. It was the railroad's own symbol for stop. It was a lie that would be used to tell the truth, but the signal was only one piece. A stopped train was a temporary problem. They needed to turn it into a permanent one. They needed the law. The real law. Silas wrote on his slate Deputy Tamsin O'Rourke, Blue Annie Bluff. He looked at June, his eyes asking a question. "Can you ride?" "I can ride," she said, her voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. He nodded once, satisfied. He went to the corral and returned not with his own sturdy gelding, but with a finer-boned, intelligent-looking mare the color of a fading sunset. "This is Penny Dusk," he said, the words startling her. He had spoken. His voice was low and rough from disuse, like the scrape of rock on rock. But it was clear. It was a name, and a name was a gift. He was giving her not just a horse, but his trust. He saddled the mare, his movements economical and sure, checking every strap, every buckle. He was entrusting her with his horse, and with their plan. "Blue Annie Bluff," he said, pointing southeast, the two words costing him a visible effort. "He'll be there." June rode out under the clearing sky, the damp leather folio containing the ledger pages and the map tied securely behind the saddle. The world felt new, sharp-edged and full of possibility. She was no longer a fugitive scurrying from shadow to shadow. She was a courier on a vital mission. Penny Dusk moved beneath her with a smooth, ground-eating gait, a living extension of the silent man's competence. The bluff was a well-known landmark, a stark upthrust of rock stained with copper oxides that gave it a blue-green sheen in the afternoon light. It was a place where one could see for miles, a place to meet without being seen. She found him there, just as Silas had said. Deputy Tamsin O'Rourke was a man who seemed to have been carved from the bluff itself. He was not tall, but broad and solid, with a sun-weathered face and calm, assessing eyes. He did not wear the crisp, official uniform of a town deputy, but the practical, durable clothes of a working man who happened to carry a badge. He nodded as she approached, his gaze taking in the mare first, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. And then June herself. "Miss," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. "Silas Hartwell must think highly of you to lend you that horse. He thinks highly of the law. Deputy," June replied, swinging down. "Or what it's supposed to be." She wasted no time. She untied the folio and spread the copied ledger pages on a flat-topped boulder between them. Baron Pike's other set of books, she said simply. Tamsin O'Rourke knelt, his initial skepticism giving way to a focused intensity as he began to read. He was a slow, methodical reader, his finger tracing the names of his neighbors, the parcels of their land. June watched his face, saw the tightening of his jaw, the slow hardening of his calm eyes. He was not a man of grand gestures. When he had read the last page, he did not swear or exclaim. He simply leaned back on his heels and let out a long, low whistle that cut through the quiet air of the bluff. It was the sound of a man seeing the full shape of a snake he had only suspected was in the grass. "I knew Pike was slick," Tamsin said, his voice hard. "I didn't know he was a damn pirate." He looked up at June, his assessment of her complete. He saw not a thief, but a witness. "Silas saved my son during the big roundup 2 years back. Pulled him from under a spooked longhorn that would have trampled him to dust. Some debts you don't pay back with money." He stood, his decision made. A plan that involved stopping a train is a hanging offense. Miss Larimer, unless it's done under the color of law. He looked toward the distant smudge on the horizon that was Quarry Bell. Judge Warham is a hard man, but he's an honest one. He's got no love for the railroad monopolies. He met her gaze, his own unwavering. You get that train stopped, and you get that proof into the judge's hand. I promise you. I will have him and a dozen honest men at Gravel Mercy Bridge by sundown tomorrow. We'll have our field hearing. The ride back to Coyote Lantern Ranch was lighter, faster. Hope was a spur, a second wind. She found Silas in the barn, the great doors open to the afternoon light. He was working, as always, mending a bridle, but his eyes snapped up the moment he heard her approach, a silent, anxious question in them. He'll be there, she said, dismounting, a triumphant smile breaking across her face. Tamsin is with us. The relief that washed over his face was profound. He reached out and stroked Penny Dusk's neck, a gesture of thanks to the mare that was meant for the rider as well. The rest of the day was spent in rehearsal. The plan's success hinged on a single, critical moment, the signal. It has to be perfect, June insisted, pacing the length of the barn. The engineer needs to see the signal at the milepost. It gives him enough track to brake safely before the trestle. If we wave it too soon, before he reaches the milepost, he'll just think it's someone by the tracks and whistle past. If we wave it 1 second too late, he won't be able to stop before he's on the bridge. Silas finished, his voice a low rasp. They needed to practice the timing, the handover, the movement. The barn, with its long, dim interior, became their stage. A post at one end served as the milepost. A chalk line on the floor was the track. Silas would be the engineer, walking at a steady pace the imagined speed of the train. June would stand at the milepost. Her job was to watch Silas, to gauge his approach, and at the exact right moment, give the sign for the true signalman to act. Silas had written on the slate, I'll wave the canvas. You give the first sign. He needs to see you first. A woman by the tracks. He'll slow to look. That's when I show the cross. It was sound logic. She was the distraction. He was the threat. They rehearsed it again and again. Silas would walk the length of the barn, his gaze fixed ahead. June would stand, heart pounding, waiting for the precise moment he crossed an imaginary line in her mind. Now, she would whisper, and 30 yards away, where Silas had set the lantern and the folded canvas, he would practice the motion, a swift, decisive swing of the lantern, a powerful snap of his wrists to unfurl the canvas with its stark black cross. Again and again, the sun dipped lower, casting long, golden shafts of light through the gaps in the barn's siding. Dust motes danced in the air, thick as summer pollen. The air grew close, tasting of rain-washed hay, old leather, and the sweet, earthy smell of the barn itself. Low thunder, the remnant of the departed storm, grumbled far to the south. On their 7th run-through, she misjudged it, lost in the rhythm, in the growing tension of the moment. She let him get a step too far. Now, she called, a fraction too late. He stopped, shaking his head. Too late, he said, his voice quiet. He walked back toward her, the folded canvas in one hand. Your mind is wandering. I know, she admitted, her face flushed with frustration. I'm sorry, let's go again. He came to stand before her, so close she could see the flecks of gold in his steady, brown eyes. He reached out, not to touch her, but to adjust the lantern he had set on a barrel beside her, which would be her signal to him. You watch my left foot, he said, his voice low, intimate in the quiet of the barn. When it crosses this line, he pointed to a crack in the floorboards. That's the moment. As he spoke, he turned slightly. His hand, coming away from the lantern, brushed against hers. It was the barest of contacts, the calloused, rough knuckles of his hand against the backs of her fingers. The world stopped. The rehearsal, the train, Barren Pike. All of it evaporated. There was only the cavernous, hay-scented quiet of the barn, the low rumble of distant thunder, and the astonishing, electric warmth of his touch. It was a fire that started in her fingers and shot up her arm, straight to her heart. She didn't pull her hand away. He didn't pull his away. They stood, frozen, their hands just touching, their breath mingling in the dusty, golden air. He looked down at their hands, then up, his gaze meeting hers. The question in his eyes had nothing to do with trains or signals. It was a question as old as the mesas, as elemental as the storm. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his other hand and cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking the line of her cheek. His touch was so exquisitely gentle it made her ache. He was not a man of words, but his hand spoke a language of profound, tender care. This was not a detour. This was not a distraction. In that moment, June realized this was the reason to be careful, the reason to be brave, the reason to win. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut, and the space between them vanished. The kiss was not what she would have expected. It was not a collision of desperate, lonely people. It was soft. It was brave. It was a quiet, mutual discovery, a question and an answer all at once. It was the taste of coffee and dust and a deep, unspoken sorrow. And beneath it all, a current of fierce, protective strength that stole her breath. They broke apart, not with a gasp, but with a shared, shaky smile. The plan still waited. The danger was still real. The romance that had just bloomed between them was not an escape from that reality, but a reason to face it head on. He let his hand fall from her face, his gaze warm and full of a new, unspoken promise. He turned to the slate that rested on a nearby hay bale. He picked up the chalk. After, he wrote the single word, a promise of a future, a time beyond the trestle, beyond the fight, a time for them. June stepped to the slate. She did not need to write. She simply reached out her finger and tapped the slate twice, just below his word. Tap, tap. After. The noon sun was a hammer, beating down on the high desert, forging the twin steel rails into wire-thin mirrors that shimmered with a blinding, liquid glare. The heat was a physical presence, a weight that pressed the scent of hot creosote and dust into the air. From the east, a sound began to separate itself from the silence. It was a faint cry at first, a lonely note that snagged on the vastness of the landscape. Then it grew, a mournful, brassy whistle that echoed off the canyon walls. The train was coming. The train was on time. June stood at the milepost, a solitary, determined figure planted beside the track. The wind, a hot, dry breath from the flats, lifted strands of her hair, whipping them across her face. She did not brush them away. Her every sense, every nerve ending, was focused on the shimmering point down the track where the train would first appear. Her heart was not fluttering with fear. It was beating with a slow, heavy, percussive rhythm. A war drum counting down the final seconds. In her mind, she saw the crack in the barn floor, Silas's left foot crossing it, the feel of his knuckles against her fingers. After, the word was a silent prayer, a promise she intended to keep. 30 yards up the track, closer to the trestle. Silas waited. He was a study in stillness, a part of the landscape. He stood with the lantern at his feet and the folded canvas sheet in his hand, his hat brim pulled low against the glare. He was not looking at her. He was watching the same point on the horizon, his entire being coiled into a state of absolute readiness. The train burst into view, a black engine spewing a plume of white steam against the brilliant blue sky. It was a magnificent, terrible machine, a symbol of the very power they were trying to break. Behind the engine and the coal car, a single passenger car gleamed with an obscene opulence. Its paint was a deep, glossy green, its brass fittings polished to a blinding shine. Through its wide, clean windows, June could see the silhouettes of men in fine suits, their heads thrown back in laughter, glasses raised in a toast. They were laughing like men who believed their money could outrun weather, outrun consequence, outrun the slow, grinding machinery of justice. They were laughing like men who had already won. June's hand, hidden in the folds of her skirt, clenched into a tight fist. She felt a cold, clean anger rise within her, burning away the last vestiges of fear. She let the train get closer, the rhythmic chuff-chuff-chuff growing into a roar, the ground beneath her feet beginning to tremble. She could see the engineer now, a man in a striped cap, leaning from his window, his face smudged with soot. He saw her, a lone woman standing by the tracks. His expression was one of mild curiosity. Perfect. She waited. The rehearsal in the barn, the endless repetition, had etched the timing into her soul. She tracked the great driving wheel of the engine. She saw it cross the imaginary line she had drawn in the dust with her heel. Now, she did not shout. She simply raised her hand, a clean, sharp, unambiguous signal. 30 yards away, Silas moved. It was a single, fluid explosion of action. He swung the lantern in a high, urgent arc, its glass flashing in the sun, in the same motion. With a powerful snap of his wrists, he unfurled the canvas sheet. The stark black cross, painted in sticky pitch, bloomed against the white background. A symbol of absolute, non-negotiable emergency. The effect on the train was immediate and dramatic. The engineer's casual curiosity vanished, replaced by a mask of professional alarm. He had seen the woman, a distraction, but he had also seen the cross, a command. Too short. Piercing blasts from the steam whistles shattered the air, the universal signal for an obstruction on the track. Almost simultaneously, there was a hellish, grinding scream as the engineer threw the brakes. Steel sang against steel, a high, tortured, metallic shriek that set June's teeth on edge. Sparks erupted from the wheels, a shower of fire against the dry landscape. The investor's car jolted violently, and June had the satisfaction of seeing the silhouettes inside lurch forward, their celebratory toasts no doubt spilling down their fine suit fronts. The train did not wreck. It did not derail. The trained hands of the engineer earned their pay. The massive engine, hissing and groaning in protest, slid to a halt not 10 feet from where Silas stood. The front of the investor's car perfectly aligned with the beginning of the gravel Mercy Bridge trestle. There was no blood. There was no crash. There was only a profound, sudden silence, broken by the immense, billowing hiss of steam from the engine. It enveloped the front of the train in a thick white cloud, a curtain dropping on one act and rising on the next, before the steam had even begun to dissipate, before the confused and angry faces of the investors had appeared at the windows. A new sound arose, the rhythmic, powerful drumming of horse hooves. From a dry wash to the west, Tamsin O'Rourke rode into view. He was not alone. Behind him were 3 deputies, their badges winking in the sun, and behind them, a string of riders, a dozen or more. They were not a posse. They were a congregation. June recognized them from the ledger pages, from her own classroom. The Thatcher twins, their young faces set with a grim, adult resolve. Widow Eloise, her back ramrod straight in the saddle, her expression one of righteous fury. Old Reverend Hingler, his white hair a halo in the noon sun, his Bible held not in his hand, but tucked securely in his saddlebag, as if today's sermon would be one of action, not words. They were the homesteaders, the farmers, the people Baron Pike had dismissed, had discounted, had thought had no teeth. Today, they had come to bite. They rode not with the wild energy of a mob, but with the slow, deliberate, unstoppable force of a glacier. They fanned out, forming a silent, unbreachable semicircle around the stopped train, their presence a quiet, powerful indictment. The door of the investor's car was thrown open and Baron Pike himself stepped out, his face a thundercloud of indignation. He was followed by his lawyer and a half-dozen bewildered, elegantly dressed men who looked profoundly out of place in the dust and heat. "What is the meaning of this outrage?" Pike bellowed, his gaze fixing on the engineer. "Why have you stopped this train?" Before the engineer could answer, June moved. She stepped off the dusty earth and onto the cinder bed of the track, the sharp, black rocks crunching under her boots. She was claiming his ground, his territory. She walked until she stood directly in front of him, the wall of steam hissing at her back. This train was stopped. "Mr. Pike," she called out. her voice clear and steady, carrying easily in the stunned silence. To convene a field hearing on the matter of illegal water rights acquisition and land fraud. Pike stared at her as if she were a ghost. His face cycled through shock, disbelief, and then settled on a sneering, contemptuous rage. "A hearing, you, a common thief, are calling a hearing." He laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You have no authority here? Woman." "She doesn't." Tamsin O'Rourke's calm voice cut in. He had dismounted and now stood beside June, a solid, reassuring presence. "But the law does." He held up a folded document. "By the authority granted in the Territorial Statute 11B, regarding public malfeasance and obstruction of commerce, any circuit judge may convene a hearing at the site of a dispute, and any sworn deputy may serve the order." Pike scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "An order from some backwater justice of the peace. It's meaningless." "I don't believe Judge Alastair Warham would agree," Tamsin said, unfolding the paper. At the bottom of the document, pressed into the paper itself, was a raised, intricate circle of wax, the official seal of the 7th District Circuit Court. June watched Pike's face. She saw the exact moment the truth landed. His sneer froze, then faltered. The color drained from his cheeks. His eyes, fixed on the seal, widened with the dawning, horrific understanding that his web of local influence, his carefully purchased immunity, had just been rendered utterly worthless. He swallowed his words, his throat working, but no sound came out. June stepped forward, holding her leather folio. "And we have evidence to present to the judge," she said. She looked past Pike to the pale, sweating faces of the investors who were now crowding the doorway of the car. "We have a copy of your second ledger, Mr. Pike, the one that details the bribes. We have the original water charter map for this valley." She paused, letting the weight of her next words land. "And we have 2 signed and sworn depositions from your former clerk, Mr. Abernathy, who found his courage last night and sought out Deputy O'Rourke." She laid the folio on a nearby crate, the papers stacked like neatly split kindling, waiting for the spark of justice to set them alight. A sound began to ripple through the assembled homesteaders. It was a low murmur, a sound that started in the chests of the Thatcher twins, that was picked up by Widow Eloise, that spread from rider to rider. It was a sound June had never heard before. The swaggering, fearful gossip of Hollowgate had been replaced by something else. This was the sound of a community finding its voice. It was no longer the sound of fear. It was the sound of an appetite for truth. Silas had moved from his position by the tracks. He now stood just at June's shoulder, a quiet, unmovable pillar of support. He had not said a word. He did not need to. His rifle was still in its scabbard on his saddle. His hands were empty and at his sides. But his presence was a statement more powerful than any threat. He was a silent wall at her back, his stillness a physical manifestation of his trust. His silence was not an absence of words. It was a space he was holding for hers. It was a silence that read, loud and clear for all to see, "Let her speak." The steam from the engine had subsided from a roar to a steady, rhythmic hiss, a restless, breathing presence that underscored the tense silence. This was their courtroom. The jury box was the stunned, silk-vested investors on the one side and the grim-faced, sun-scorched homesteaders on the other. The sky was their ceiling, the wind their bailiff, carrying the scent of hot metal and dry earth. A new figure emerged, and all eyes turned. He had not come with the posse. He had been on the train, in the caboose, a passenger bound for Quarry Bell. Judge Alastair Warham stepped down onto the cinder bed, and the entire atmosphere changed, snapping into a sharp, legal focus. He was a man in his 60s, lean as a fence post, with eyes the color of a winter sky hawk-sharp, missing nothing. He wore a simple black frock coat, not judicial robes, but his entire being radiated an authority that was absolute. In his coat pocket, June could see the faint, hard outline of a wooden gavel, a symbol of a court he carried with him. He walked past Pike, past June, and stood on a small, flat patch of ground between the tracks and the homesteaders. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. I am Judge Alistair Warham, 7th District Circuit Court, he stated, his voice a dry rasp that cut through the wind. Deputy O'Rourke has presented me with sworn affidavits and a request for an emergency hearing under Territorial Statute 11B. Given the extraordinary circumstances and the presence of all relevant parties, I am convening this court, here and now, to examine the claims and determine if an injunction and arrests are warranted. He looked at Pike. Mr. Pike, I see you have counsel. You may speak first. A slick, well-dressed man, Pike's lawyer. Mr. Blaisdell stepped forward, his face a mask of professional indignation. He held a leather briefcase as if it were a shield. Your Honor, this is a farce, Blaisdell began, his voice smooth and practiced. This gathering is the result of a malicious act. My client's train was illegally stopped. His private property, that folio, was stolen by this woman, Juniper Larimer, who is a known fugitive from the law in Hollow Gate. We cite possession. Your Honor, the evidence she presents was obtained illegally. It is fruit of a poisonous tree. We demand this hearing be dismissed and Miss Larimer be arrested for theft. And these men, he gestured to Silas and Tamsin, for interfering with commerce. The investors nodded, their confidence returning. It was a sound legal argument, one that had worked in many other courtrooms. Blaisdell smiled, a thin, satisfied expression. The law is clear. Possession is 9/10. June felt a flicker of fear. The man's words were slick, designed to tangle the truth in procedure. But then she felt the solid presence of Silas at her back, a silent, unmoving anchor. She took a breath and stepped forward. Your Honor, she said, her voice clear, her schoolteacher's cadence cutting through the legal jargon. Mr. Blaisdell speaks of possession. I speak of forgery. I speak of coercion. And I speak of a water charter that is older than his client's railroad, older than the town of Hollow Gate itself. She pointed to the folio. That is not stolen property. It is a copy of a second ledger, a fraudulent ledger, Mr. Pike kept to document his crimes. The real theft is documented within it. He is stealing the water rights of every family here. She gestured to the homesteaders. And as for possession, Mr. Pike does not possess the water of Black Fiddle Creek. The people of this valley do, under the Territorial Water Charter of 1853, which I also have right here. Judge Warham's hawk-like gaze fixed on her, then on the papers. A serious claim. Miss Larimer. You will have to prove it. He turned his gaze to the crowd of homesteaders. You claim witnesses. I will hear them. Step forward. Widow Eloise was the first. She was a small, bird-like woman, her hands twisted by work and rheumatism, but her back was iron straight as she dismounted and walked to stand before the judge. Your Honor, she began, her voice trembling but gaining strength with every word. My name is Eloise Miller. My husband, God rest him, and I filed on our parcel on Black Fiddle Creek in '54. We built our soddy, we dug our well. The creek was our life. She pointed a gnarled finger at Pike. Then, last spring, I took ill, a fever, while I was in my bed. Mr. Pike's survey men came. When I was well enough to walk, I found new stakes, my creek frontage. It was gone. They had replatted my lot. They said, moved my property line back 100 yards. They told me the original survey was a clerical error, my husband's grave. Her voice broke, but she did not weep. My husband's grave is now on railroad land. A low, angry murmur rose from the homesteaders. Judge Warham silenced it with a look. Thank you, Mrs. Miller. He looked back at the crowd. Next, the Thatcher twins, barely 18, all lanky limbs and identical, furious faces, stepped forward together, speaking as one. Judge, said the first, we're the Thatcher boys. Our PA runs the grist mill. The public ford, south of here, said the second. It's been the public ford since before we was born. Everyone crosses there. Last month, the first continued. Levi Drum and a crew of men hired by Mr. Pike came and fenced it off. Put up no trespassing signs. Said it was dry comet land now. Said we had to pay a toll to cross. But the toll ain't the point, the second twin finished, his voice cracking with a youthful indignation. It's a public Ford. He can't just take it. Judge Warham nodded slowly, his face grim. He turned his attention to the train crew. The engineer. Step forward. A burly man in a soot-stained striped cap. Mr. Grogan nervously approached, twisting his cap in his hands. Sir, the judge said, his voice not unkind. You were at the throttle. Describe what you saw. Grogan swallowed, his gaze flicking nervously toward Pike, then settling on the judge's commanding face. Your Honor, I was running on time, just east of the trestle. I saw the woman, Miss Larimer, by the milepost. I was curious, I'll admit, but then, 30 yards up, the man, he nodded to Silas. He flagged me. He swung a lantern and unfurled a canvas. It was a white sheet with a black cross. Sir, that is a recognized emergency signal. It's in the company manual. It means washout, rock slide, or critical track failure ahead. It's not a suggestion. It's a command. I am legally and morally bound to stop. To ignore it is to risk the lives of every soul on this train. It was not a malicious act. Your Honor, it was a lawful stop. By the book. The investors, who had been looking angry, now looked pale. The word derailment had put their own safety into perspective. Blaisdell's claim of malicious interference evaporated into the dry, hot air. Thank you, Mr. Grogan. You did your duty, Warham said. He then looked at Tamsin. Deputy, your affidavit mentions a Mr. Abernathy, a small, bird-like man who had been standing half-hidden behind Tamsin O'Rourke, stepped forward. It was Abernathy, Pike's former clerk. He was trembling so violently that the papers in his hand rattled. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. Baron Pike's eyes bored into him, a look of pure, cold venom. Mr. Abernathy, the judge said, his voice gentle. You are the clerk for the Dry Comet Land Company. What is your testimony? Abernathy licked his dry, cracked lips. He looked at Pike, then at June. He saw the cold promise of death in Pike's eyes, and the steady, quiet promise of support in June's. He took a deep, shuddering breath and found his voice. He told me to burn it, Abernathy whispered, his voice shaking. After Miss Larimer confronted me, Baron Pike, he came to my office. He told me to burn the second ledger, the real one. And did you? The judge asked. No, sir, I couldn't. The man's voice grew stronger. I was afraid, but I couldn't be a part of it. Not after I saw what it was doing to folks. He looked at June. I saved pages. I hid them. When Miss Larimer fled, I ran, too. I ran to Deputy O'Rourke. He held out the shaking papers. These copies Miss Larimer has, they are true. I swear it. That is my handwriting, and that, he pointed to the map. That is the genuine seal of the Hollowgate Land Office. I watched him forge the claims myself, using a tracing of it. The case was made. The air was electric. Blaisdell, Pike's lawyer, looked utterly defeated, his briefcase hanging limply at his side. Judge Warham looked at June. His sharp eyes had softened. Just a fraction. He asked one final question, not for the court, but for himself. You had this proof, Miss Larimer. You could have taken that horse and been in the next territory by now. Safe. Why stay? Why this theater? Why stop a train? June looked at the homesteaders, at Widow Eloise's tear-streaked, grateful face. She looked at the brown, angry water of Black Fiddle Creek, visible in the gorge below the trestle. She met the judge's gaze, her own clear and unwavering. Because running only saves me, she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that silenced the wind. This saves the creek. Pike could not contain himself. The ruling was obvious. His empire, built on paper and fear, was crumbling. He shoved his lawyer aside, his face purple with rage. Progress, he roared, his voice cracking. You are standing in the way of progress. This is the future. The railroad is the lifeblood of this territory. These people, he spat the word. These sod-busting Hanyakers are holding back civilization. For what a trickle of mud, I am building a future here." Judge Warham let the man's tirade echo and die in the vast silence. When all was quiet again, the judge asked a simple, devastating question. "And why, Mr. Pike, does your progress demand theft?" Pike had no answer. He stood, his mouth open, his bluster and his future gone. The investors behind him quietly, almost imperceptibly, stepped away, distancing themselves from the man they had toasted an hour earlier. Judge Warham did not even consult a book. He stood in the wind, the sole authority, and delivered his ruling. "This court finds sufficient and overwhelming cause. I am issuing an immediate injunction on all land and water claims filed by the Dry Comet Land Rail Company pertaining to the Black Fiddle Creek Basin." A sound, a gasp, went through the homesteaders. "I am furthermore issuing a warrant for the arrest of Baron Pike on charges of forgery, conspiracy to defraud, and coercion, pending a full trial." Tamsin O'Rourke stepped forward, a pair of steel handcuffs in his hand. "And finally," the judge concluded, his voice ringing with authority, "this court orders the immediate provisional return of all water control and disputed ford access to the Black Fiddle Creek Homesteaders Committee, effective immediately. Deputy, see to the fences." For a second, there was absolute silence. The only sound was the wind and the hissing of the engine. Then, a great, collective sigh passed through the crowd of homesteaders. Shoulders that had been slumped for months with weariness and defeat dropped in relief. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, Widow Eloise let out a sound. It was not a cheer. It was a laugh. A short, sharp, joyous sound, like a door that had been rusted shut for a decade finally being kicked open. June stood, her knees suddenly weak, her entire body trembling with the release of a tension she'd carried for days, for weeks. She had done it. They had done it. Sila. He had not moved. He had not spoken. He had been a silent pillar, a quiet law unto himself. As Tamsin O'Rourke read Baron Pike his rights and snapped the cuffs onto his wrists, as the homesteaders began to laugh and embrace, Silas turned his head, just slightly. He looked at June. Then his large, calloused hand, the hand that knew rope and wire and hard work, found hers. He didn't pat it, he didn't squeeze it, he simply took it, lacing his fingers through hers, and held on. It was a gesture that said nothing, and said everything. It was not a gesture of congratulations. It was a gesture of solidarity. It was a promise, a quiet, unbreakable vow made in the desert wind. It was the end of running. The joyous laughter of Widow Eloise was still hanging in the air when the scene fractured. It happened in an instant. A sudden, violent tearing of the fragile peace. Baron Pike, his face a mask of disbelief as Tamsin O'Rourke snapped the first steel cuff around his wrist, was a symbol of the law's victory. But Levi Drum was a symbol of its defiance. He had been standing near the horses, a silent, mud-caked observer to his employer's downfall. He saw his future in those handcuffs, a future of being implicated, of facing a rope or a long prison term. He was not a man of legal arguments. He was a creature of violent action, and he bolted. There was no warning. One moment he was still, the next he was a blur of motion. He launched himself toward his horse, his spurs flashing in the sun, a desperate, animalistic bid for freedom. Two of the other hired hands, younger men whose loyalty was not to Pike but to the chaos Drum represented, reacted a half-second later, their eyes wide with panic. They followed his lead, scrambling for their own mounts. Their target was clear the trestle. If they could get across the bridge and into the broken country on the other side, they could disappear. "Stop!" Tamsin O'Rourke bellowed, turning from Pike. "In the name of the law." But Drum did not recognize the law. He swung into his saddle, raking his horse's flanks with his spurs. The animal lunged forward, churning the cinder bed. Silas did not shout. He moved. His hand dropped June's, the promise of after momentarily deferred by the brutal reality of now. He was already sprinting toward his own horse, his movements a fluid, powerful economy of motion. Tamsin, leaving Pike in the stunned custody of his other deputies, mounted his own horse, his face set in a grim line. Silas, with me, the rest of you. Hold the line. The chase was on. Drum and his two riders galloped hard, leaving the train and the crowd behind, their horses' hooves striking sparks from the rails. They veered off the track, plunging into the wide, rocky expanse of split lantern wash, the very arroyo Silas had once pointed out to June as an escape route. Silas and Tamsin were right behind them, their mounts more sure-footed, more familiar with this treacherous ground. The wash was a chaotic symphony of sound and motion. Hooves hammered on the loose rock, sending sprays of gray shale flying through the air like shrapnel. A flock of ravens, disturbed from their scavenging, lifted from a dead cottonwood in a single, flowing black ribbon, their harsh cries a protest against the intrusion. The chase was a raw, kinetic thing, a desperate flight and a relentless pursuit etched across the ancient, indifferent landscape. They were gaining. Drum, looking back over his shoulder, his face a mask of desperate fury, knew it. He needed to create a diversion, to break their focus. He drew his revolver, the same one he had rested his hand on so arrogantly the night before, but he did not aim at his pursuers. He twisted in his saddle and fired a single shot straight up into the air. The crack of the pistol shot was sharp and loud, but it was the effect he was after. He was aiming at the train. The engine, which had been hissing quietly, reacted as if it had been struck. The horses, the cattle, the very men on the train were all creatures of flesh and blood, prone to panic. The engineer, Mr. Grogan, understood Drum's intent instantly. He was trying to spook the engine, to create a panic that might cause the boiler to blow, or at the very least, send the homesteaders scattering, breaking the line of law and order that had been so carefully drawn. Mr. Grogan's answer was not one of fear. It was one of pure, mechanical fury. He grabbed the whistle cord and pulled, not in a short, sharp blast, but in a long, sustained, deafening scream. The train whistle, which had heralded the train's arrival, now became a weapon. It was a roar of defiance, the voice of the machine answering the man's petty violence with its own overwhelming power. It was a sound that said, "This is my track. You will not have it." The blast momentarily startled Drum's horse, causing it to break stride. It was the only opening Silas needed. He was riding parallel to Drum, his body low over his horse's neck. In his hand, he held the coiled lariat from his saddle. He did not seem to aim. He did not pause. In one smooth, continuous motion, an extension of the gallop itself, his wrist flicked, the rope shot out, not as a wide, hopeful loop, but as a tight, fast-moving circle, a living thing with a single purpose. The loop sailed over Drum's head and dropped, not around his neck or his shoulders, but perfectly, impossibly, around his outstretched right wrist, the wrist of his gun hand. Silas did not yank. He simply let his horse continue its forward motion, the rope pulling taut between them. The shock on Drum's arm was immense. The revolver, jolted from his grasp, flew from his fingers, spun end over end in the bright sun, and clattered into the rocky bed of the wash, lost to the chase. Drum roared in a mixture of pain and fury. He jerked his arm violently, a desperate, twisting motion. He was a strong man, and the angle was awkward. He managed to pull his hand free from the loop, but he was disarmed. His primary advantage gone. The dynamic of the chase had changed. One of the hired hands, seeing his leader disarmed, made a choice. He broke away, kicking his horse hard, aiming not for the trestle, but for the open country. The other, however, a young man with more panic than sense in his eyes, stuck with Drum, galloping hard for the base of the bridge. June watched it all, her heart in her throat. She was not a spectator. Tamsin and Silas were focused on Drum. The third rider was her responsibility. She was still mounted on Penny Dusk, the mare's intelligent ears swiveling, her body tense. "Easy, girl," June whispered, and nudged her forward. She did not charge. She rode with a purpose, her path not a direct pursuit, but an interception. The fleeing rider was focused on the open space ahead. He did not see her, a lone woman on a fast horse, cutting across his path at an angle. She used the terrain, her schoolteacher's mind assessing the geometry of the landscape. Ahead of the rider was a tall, sheer outcropping of rock, a limestone shelf bleached white by the sun. She urged Penny Dusk on, her speed surprising. The rider looked up and saw her, a determined figure suddenly blocking his escape route. He tried to swerve, but she was already there, positioning Penny Dusk to flank him, to gently but inexorably herd him toward the unyielding wall of rock. He had two choices: crash into the limestone shelf, or pull up. He looked at her face, saw not bloodlust, but a calm, unshakable resolve. He looked back at the scene by the train, at the dozen armed homesteaders, at the badge of the deputy. The fight was over. He had been hired for a job, not to die for it. He pulled hard on his reins, his horse skidding to a halt just feet from the rock face. He slowly, deliberately, raised his empty hands into the air. He had surrendered to the simple, overwhelming notion of living. At the trestle, the final act was playing out. Drum, his face a mask of primal fury, had abandoned his horse. He was scrambling up the steep embankment to the base of the great wooden structure, a maintenance ladder. A series of iron rungs bolted into the massive timbers led up to the track bed. He began to climb, a desperate, clawing ascent. Silas was off his horse in an instant, moving with a silent, lethal grace. He started up the ladder after him. The sky, which had been a clear, hard blue, was beginning to shift. A few stray clouds, messengers from a distant storm, were gathering, and the first fat, cold drops of rain began to fall. The great bridge, silent until now, began to hum, a low, resonant vibration from the sheer force of the wind moving through its complex skeleton of wood and iron. Silas caught up to Drum halfway up the ladder. Drum kicked out, trying to send him falling, but Silas moved with the agility of a cat, easily avoiding the clumsy blow. He reached up, not to strike, but to grab. His hand shot out and seized Drum's ankle. There was no melodrama. There was no prolonged, desperate struggle on the edge of a precipice. There was only Silas Hartwell's profound, practical competence. He did not try to pull Drum from the ladder. He simply found what he was looking for: a pinched nerve, a pressure point just behind the ankle bone, a piece of knowledge learned in a war or a bar fight or from simple, hard experience. He squeezed. Drum's leg went numb. A jolt of pure, electric fire shot up his calf, and his muscles simply ceased to obey. He cried out, a sound of pained surprise, his grip on the rung faltering. With his other hand, Silas gave a sharp, decisive tug. It was not a killing blow, not an act of vengeance. It was a simple, biomechanical act of control. Drum's body went limp, his strength stolen from him, and Silas easily maneuvered him, holding him against the rungs. Tamsin, who had just reached the base of the ladder, had a pair of cuffs ready. In a matter of seconds, Levi Drum was securely cuffed by one wrist to the cold iron of the maintenance ladder, a prisoner of the very structure he had sought as a refuge. The last rider, the one who had fled toward open country, hadn't gotten far. He had kicked his horse for distance, but his path was cut off by an unexpected obstacle: the Thatcher twins. The boys Pike had dismissed as men without teeth had anticipated his move. They rode out, not with guns drawn, but with a quiet, determined flanking maneuver of their own. They didn't chase him, they simply boxed him in, their movements calm and practiced, gently forcing him against the wall of a railroad tool shed. The rider, seeing no escape and no malice in the faces of the two young men, wisely gave up. Back on the ground, Tamsin cut Levi Drum free from the ladder and led him, sullen and defeated, back toward the train. The rain was falling harder now, washing the sweat and dust from his face. He stumbled, spitting out a mouthful of rain and grit. He looked at the circle of silent homesteaders who had gathered to watch his capture. "I never liked Pike anyway," he snarled. A coward's last, pathetic gambit. He was a fool. Nobody bothered to answer. June stood with the surrendered rider, watching as the law, real and absolute, gathered its prisoners. The trestle, a great, dark skeleton against the bruised sky, still stood. The law, embodied by a hawk-eyed judge and a handful of determined citizens, still stood. The town, the valley, the community of homesteaders, represented by the Thatcher twins and Widow Eloise and all the others, still stood. Everything that mattered had held. The chaos of the chase had bled away, leaving behind a strange, ringing silence at the foot of Gravel Mercy Bridge. The air was thick with the smells of ozone from the coming rain, hot steel from the engine, and the sharp, undeniable scent of justice. Back at the stopped train, the final formal act of Baron Pike's undoing was underway. Judge Warham, using an overturned shipping crate as his desk, reviewed the arrest order Tamsin O'Rourke had drafted. He produced a fountain pen from his coat, its nib scratching authoritatively across the paper. He signed his name, Alistair Warham, with a flourish that was not ostentatious, but deeply, profoundly final. The ink was a black verdict against the paper. As Tamsin took the document, Pike, held between two deputies, stumbled. His famous white felt hat, which he had somehow managed to keep on his head, was knocked loose. It fell to the muddy ground with a soft, wet plop. No one bothered to pick it up. It lay there, its pristine whiteness instantly stained, its proud shape collapsing, the shine of its owner's arrogance washed away by the common, indifferent mud. The investors, who had been huddled together like nervous sheep, watched this with stiff, frozen smiles. Their brief adventure into frontier capitalism had turned into a criminal conspiracy, and their primary concern now was extricating themselves. One man, a portly fellow with a gold watch chain, very slowly, very deliberately, reached up to his lapel. He unpinned a small, gaudy pin, the insignia of the Dry Comet Land Rail Company's Investors Club. He looked at it for a moment, then let it drop from his fingers into the dust. It suddenly weighed too much. One by one, the others followed suit, quietly severing their ties, their loyalty evaporating as quickly as a puddle in the noon sun. But the most important ceremony was yet to come. The homesteaders, no longer a posse, but now, officially, the Black Fiddle Creek Homesteaders Committee, gathered at the open door of a boxcar. Two of the Thatcher twins, with a reverence usually reserved for scripture, carefully unrolled the original water charter of 1853. The paper was old, yellowed, and fragile, its edges soft as felt. But the ink, written in a bold, looping hand, was still dark and clear. It was a document of promises made, of a community's birthright. They laid it flat on the rough, splintered floor of the boxcar. Judge Warham stepped up into the car. He did not produce an old seal. From a leather pouch, he took a brand new one, its brass face gleaming, and a stick of dark red sealing wax. He lit the wax with a match, the flame bright in the growing gloom of the storm, and let the molten drops fall onto the ancient document, beside the faded signature of a territorial governor from a generation ago. Then, with a firm, steady pressure, he affixed a fresh seal, the symbol of the 7th District Circuit Court, a guarantee from the law of today, reinforcing the promise of yesterday. Black Fiddle Creek belonged to its people again. A quiet, collective sob of relief went through the assembled families. Widow Eloise was openly weeping now, not tears of sorrow, but of a joy so profound it was painful. Reverend Hingler took off his hat and bowed his head, his lips moving in a silent prayer of thanks. June stood a little apart from the celebration, her gaze fixed on the folio of papers resting on the crate, the ledger pages that had been her death warrant, the map that had been her guide through the wilderness, the thin armor that had, against all odds, held. She thought of her arrival at Coyote Lantern Ranch, a terrified, staggering creature, her hands shaking so badly she could barely untie the folio's strings. She looked down at her hands now. They were steady. Pike was being led past her, his head bowed, his fine suit stained with mud and humiliation. He stopped, forcing the deputies to a halt. He raised his head and looked at her. His eyes, which had always held a cold, calculating fire, were now hollowed out with desperation. In them, she saw a silent, pathetic plea. He was looking to her for mercy, for some word, some gesture that might soften his fall. He was looking for a grace he himself had never learned how to give. June looked back at him, her expression not of triumph, not of hatred, but of a calm, clear-eyed finality. She offered him nothing, nothing but the truth he had so meticulously earned for himself. She simply held his gaze until he looked away, defeated. Tamsin O'Rourke stepped forward, the signed arrest order in his hand. He stood before Pike and began to read the charges, his voice clear and strong, rising over the wind. Baron Pike, you are under arrest for the crimes of forgery, conspiracy to defraud, coercion of a public official, and— The crowd did not cheer. They did not jeer. They fell utterly silent, a deep, reverent quiet that felt like prayer. They listened as the law, their law, spoke its name, cataloging the sins that had been committed against them, and promising a reckoning. Tamsin's voice was the only human sound, a clear, righteous bell tolling the end of a long, dark night. As he finished the last charge, a single, tremendous peal of thunder rolled across the sky, a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the trestle, and with it, the first fat, cold drops of rain began to fall, marking the dust with dark, spreading circles. The land, which had been a silent witness, finally seemed to nod its head in solemn agreement. The public spectacle was over. The private one was just beginning. June turned from the scene of Pike's arrest. Her duty done, her fight won. She turned to the man who had made it possible. Silas stood where he had been all along, a silent pillar at her side. She opened her mouth to speak, to thank him, to say— What words were there for this? For the quiet courage, the unspoken trust, the shared victory that had been forged between them in the heat and the storm. The words piled up against her teeth, a useless, inadequate jumble, and refused to go. So she reached for him. It was an instinct, a need more profound than language. Her hand found his, and she laced her fingers through his, her grip tight, anchoring herself to him. He looked down at their joined hands, then into her eyes. The question was there, the promise of after. No longer a distant hope, but a present reality. He led her away from the crowd, away from the congratulations of the homesteaders, to the small, sheltered space beneath the eaves of the boxcar. The rain was coming down harder now, a stuttering, silver curtain that enclosed them, creating a private world in the midst of the public celebration. The sound of the rain on the boxcar roof was a gentle, insistent drumming. He raised his free hand and cupped her face, his calloused thumb stroking her cheek, wiping away a single raindrop that might have been a tear. The tenderness in his touch, from a man so hard and silent, undid her. They found each other then, beneath the boxcar eaves. It was a long, unhurried kiss that sealed the vow that neither of them knew how to say. It was a kiss of gratitude, of relief, of a shared solitude that was no longer lonely. It was the end of a fight and the beginning of a peace they would build together. That night, at Coyote Lantern Ranch, the storm that had cleansed the valley raged outside, its fury a welcome, protective sound. The door was closed. The heavy bar slid into place, not against a threat, but against the memory of one. By the warm, glowing hearth, two pairs of boots sat side by side, one large and worn, the other smaller, mended, both caked with the mud of a shared victory. On the small table between their two chairs, 2 cups of coffee steamed, their fragrant vapor mingling with the scent of cedar smoke and the clean smell of rain. Our gaze stops at the threshold. We do not intrude on this hard-won peace. We see their hands meet across the table, fingers lacing together. We see their foreheads rest against each other, a silent communion of souls who have found their harbor. We see Silas reach out and lower the lamp's wick, the golden light softening, shrinking to an intimate, warm glow before darkness enfolds them. There is no spectacle, no grand declaration, just breath and held warmth, a passion folded gently, respectfully, into privacy. Outside. The rain drums a final, steady verdict on the roof. Justice has been served. The water has been returned. The predator has been undone. The frame freezes on their joined hands, resting on the table beside the neatly stacked ledger pages and the simple tin locket, the proof of the crime, the ghost of the past, and the promise of the future, all together in a single perfect image. The revenge is complete. The victory is absolute. There is no epilogue. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know where in the world you're listening from. Please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like, and if you really enjoyed it, hit that hype button to help this story reach even more listeners.